The Abbasid Caliphate once ruled over one of the largest empires on earth. From North Africa to Persia, its authority stretched across deserts, ports, cities, and sacred lands. But empires rarely collapse suddenly. First, they weaken silently. Power becomes distant, corruption grows unnoticed, and somewhere far from the capital, new forces begin to rise. For the Abbasids, that force emerged from the shadows of Eastern Arabia, a movement that would soon terrify the Islamic world: the Qarmatians. The Qarmatians were not simply rebels, they were revolutionaries. They rejected the authority of the Abbasid rulers, rejected traditional structures, rejected the growing inequality spreading across the Islamic world. And in regions where poverty and resentment already existed, their message spread quickly, especially among workers, tribes, and communities living far from Baghdad. To some, they appeared dangerous. To others, they appeared liberating. And history has shown many times movement become powerful when people stop believing the system protects them. The Abbasid Caliphate feared armies, but what frightened it more were ideas. Because armies can be destroyed, ideas cannot. The Qarmatians built networks, secret alliances, hidden communications, and slowly their influence expanded across Eastern Arabia and the Gulf. Not through massive battles, but through persuasion, organization, and patience. Eventually, the Qarmatians established control over parts of Eastern Arabia. And for the Abbasids, this was more than rebellion, it was humiliation. A rival force now existed inside the Islamic world itself, independent, armed, ideologically driven. And unlike ordinary raiders, the Qarmatians believed history was on their side. That belief made them dangerous, because movements fueled by certainty rarely compromise. At the heart of the Islamic world stood Masjid al-Haram, the holiest sanctuary in Islam, a place beyond politics, beyond tribal conflict, a destination millions considered sacred. For centuries, even rival powers respected its sanctity, which is why what happened next shocked the world. In the year 930, during the pilgrimage season, the unimaginable happened. The Qarmatians attacked Mecca. Pilgrims were caught completely unprepared. Panic spread instantly. The sanctuary that symbolized peace became chaos. And across the Islamic world, disbelief turned into horror. The attack was not shocking only because of violence. It was shocking because it shattered assumptions. People believed some places were untouchable, protected, sacred. But the Qarmatians proved something terrifying. Even the holiest places could become vulnerable when political order collapses. And psychologically, that realization spread fear far beyond Mecca itself. Then came the act that would define the Qarmatians forever. They took the Black Stone, one of Islam's most sacred symbols, removed from the Kaaba itself, and carried away. For many Muslims, this was more than theft. It felt like history itself had been violated. But why would they do something so extreme? Some historians believe the attack was political, a direct challenge to Abbasid authority. Others argue it was ideological, a rejection of religious structures they viewed as corrupted. And perhaps it was both. Because throughout history, radical movements often seek symbolic targets, not only to gain power, but to reshape reality itself. The reaction was immediate: shock, rage, humiliation. The Abbasid Caliphate now faced a devastating truth. It could no longer fully protect the sacred heart of Islam. And when empires lose symbolic authority, their decline accelerates. Because power is not sustained only through armies, it survives through belief. But the Qarmatians had done more than attack Mecca. They had declared war on the existing order itself. And soon, the Islamic world would fight back. The attack on Masjid al-Haram did more than shock the Islamic world. It exposed weakness. For centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate had ruled through symbolism as much as force. The Caliph was not merely a political ruler, he represented unity, religious legitimacy, order. But after the Qarmatian attack, that illusion began to crack. Because people across the Islamic world started asking a dangerous question. If the Abbasids could not protect Mecca, what could they protect? News moved slowly in the medieval world, but fear moved faster. Caravans carried stories across deserts. Merchants spread rumors through ports. Pilgrims returned home with horror in their voices. And gradually, the Qarmatians transformed from rebels into a nightmare. Not because they controlled the largest army, but because they had shattered psychological boundaries. They had proven that the impossible could happen. The Qarmatians understood something many empires failed to understand. People do not join radical movements only because of ideology. They join because they feel abandoned, humiliated, ignored. And in parts of Eastern Arabia, resentment toward distant rulers had already been growing for years. Economic inequality, political neglect, heavy taxation. The Abbasids controlled vast lands, but distance weakens authority. And where trust disappears, alternative systems emerge. For years, the Black Stone remained away from Mecca. Its absence became symbolic, a visible wound in the Islamic world. And symbolically, the Qarmatians gained power from that absence. Because every pilgrimage, every prayer, every mention of Mecca reminded people of what had happened. The Abbasids were no longer seen as invincible, and once the myth of invincibility dies, decline accelerates. Revolutionary movements often begin with ideals, but power changes movements, slowly, silently. The Qarmatians had once positioned themselves as challengers to corruption. Now, they ruled territory themselves, collected taxes, maintained armies, controlled trade routes, and inevitably internal divisions began to appear, because governing is far harder than rebellion. The Qarmatians frightened much of the Islamic world, but fear creates isolation. Trade relationships weakened, enemies multiplied. And while the Abbasids struggled internally, they were not alone. Regional powers began pushing back, because no empire wanted instability spreading across trade networks and holy cities. Gradually, the Qarmatians found themselves surrounded, not by one enemy, but many. Empires survive on resources, trade, stability, and trust. As conflict intensified, the Qarmatian economy weakened. Trade routes shifted, merchants avoided dangerous regions, and maintaining military power became increasingly difficult. History often remembers dramatic battles, but many powers collapse more quietly, through exhaustion, through economic pressure, through slow internal decay. Eventually, after years of pressure and negotiation, the Black Stone was returned to Mecca. But by then, something irreversible had happened. The psychological damage remained. The attack had permanently altered perceptions of power in the Islamic world, and the Qarmatians themselves were beginning to weaken from within. As decades passed, the movement fractured. Leadership disputes emerged, alliances collapsed, and younger generations no longer carried the same revolutionary energy. This is the paradox of radical movements. The first generation fights to build the revolution. The next generation inherits its consequences. And eventually, certainty gives way to survival. As their influence declined, some groups moved eastward, toward the Gulf Coast, toward scattered settlements, and strategic maritime regions. The deserts of Arabia had always been connected to the sea. Trade routes linked inland tribes with coastal communities, and slowly, new identities began to emerge along the shores of Oman and the Gulf, places that would one day become part of a much larger story. The Qarmatians would eventually fade from power, but history rarely erases movements completely. Ideas survive, trauma survives, migration reshapes societies, and the Gulf itself was about to enter a new era. One defined not by holy cities, but by trade, tribes, and control of the sea. Because while empires fought over land, the future of the Gulf would be decided on water. Long before oil, before skyscrapers, before global wealth transformed the region, the Gulf was already important. Not because of what lay beneath the sand, but because of the sea. The waters of the Gulf connected worlds. India, Persia, East Africa, Mesopotamia. For centuries, ships carried spices, pearls, textiles, and ideas across these waters. And along the coastline, small settlements slowly evolved into strategic communities. The desert may have appeared empty from afar, but the Gulf was alive. Life along the Gulf Coast was harsh. The heat was relentless. Fresh water was limited. Storms could destroy entire fishing communities overnight. Yet people adapted. Communities survived through fishing, trade, and pearl diving. Every family depended on the sea, and psychologically, that created a different type of society. Flexible, resilient, independent, because survival here required constant movement between danger and opportunity. Pearl diving was more than work. It was risk. Divers descended into dark waters with almost no protection, holding their breath, searching blindly beneath the seafloor. Every dive carried uncertainty, and yet, generation after generation continued, because pearls meant survival, status, trade. The Gulf became connected to global luxury markets, even while many divers themselves remained poor, a contradiction that would shape the region for centuries. But trade alone did not define the Gulf. Tribes controlled movement across land and sea. Some formed alliances, others fought over territory, ports, and trade routes. Power in the Gulf was rarely centralized, it shifted constantly. One season, a tribe controlled a coastline. The next, a rival force challenged it. And unlike massive empires, tribal power depended heavily on loyalty, on reputation, on leadership. If trust disappeared, alliances collapsed quickly. The Gulf existed between larger powers, Persian influence to the north, Arabian tribes to the south, Ottoman ambitions in the west, and powerful trade routes linking Asia to Europe. This made the region strategically valuable, but it also made it unstable, because every empire understood one thing: control the Gulf and you influence commerce itself. As trade intensified, so did conflict. Ships carried wealth, and wealth attracts violence. Raids became common. Ports competed aggressively. Some powers called it piracy, others called it survival. But in reality, control over the Gulf was becoming increasingly militarized. And slowly, outside powers began paying closer attention, especially one empire rising far beyond Arabia. Despite instability, coastal settlements continued growing. Trade created opportunity, pearls created wealth, and gradually, new local identities emerged along the Gulf Coast. Families built influence through commerce, ports expanded, and certain regions became increasingly important for regional trade networks. Places that once seemed isolated were now becoming connected to the wider world. The old revolutionary movements had faded, but migration leaves traces. Ideas travel through generations. Communities absorb influences slowly over time. And the Gulf Coast became a meeting point of histories. Arab tribes, Persian influence, religious movements, trade cultures, African connections, Indian commerce. The Gulf was never isolated. It was interconnected long before globalization existed. Empires had long focused on deserts and cities, but the future of the Gulf belonged to the sea. Whoever controlled maritime trade would shape the region's destiny. And soon, European powers would arrive with ships far larger, weapons far stronger, and ambitions far greater than anything the Gulf had seen before. The Gulf stood at the edge of transformation. The tribal world was still alive, the pearl economy still dominated, but powerful foreign interests were approaching. And once global empires enter a region, history accelerates. The coastline that would one day become United Arab Emirates was about to enter its most defining chapter, because the next empire to enter the Gulf would not arrive on horseback. It would arrive by sea. For centuries, the Gulf had been shaped by tribes, trade, and regional rivalries. But now, a completely different kind of power was approaching. An empire built not on deserts, but on oceans. The United Kingdom did not arrive in the Gulf searching for land. It came searching for control. Control over trade routes, control over maritime movement, control over the connection between Europe and Asia. And the Gulf stood directly in the middle of that global network. To understand British strategy, you must understand geography. The Gulf was not important because of oil. Not yet. At this point in history, oil had not transformed the region. What mattered was access. Ships traveling to India passed through critical maritime routes connected to the Gulf. And for the British Empire, India was everything. Economically, politically, strategically. Protecting those routes became an obsession, because empires fear disruption more than enemies. British officials viewed the Gulf differently than local tribes did. To coastal communities, the sea meant survival. Fishing, pearls, trade. But to the British Empire, the Gulf was a strategic corridor, a space that needed stability, predictability, control. And whenever empires seek stability, they often reshape entire regions to achieve it. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, conflict across Gulf waters intensified. British trade ships were attacked. Regional maritime raids increased, and British officials began describing parts of the coast as dangerous. Some British records labeled local maritime groups as pirates. But history is rarely that simple. because labels often depend on perspective. To the British Empire, attacking trade routes threatened imperial commerce. To some local tribes, those same waters represented contested territory and survival. The British Empire responded with overwhelming force. Naval campaigns targeted coastal strongholds, ports were attacked, ships destroyed. The message was clear: the Gulf would not remain outside British influence. But military power alone was never enough. The British understood something crucial. Long-term control required agreements, alliances, political restructuring, and slowly, they began building a new system across the Gulf Coast. Eventually, a series of agreements emerged between Britain and local rulers. These treaties aimed to reduce maritime conflict, and over time, the coastline became known to the British as the Trucial Coast, a name tied directly to truces and maritime agreements. This was a turning point, because for the first time, external imperial influence became deeply embedded in the political structure of the region, not through full colonization, but through strategic dependency. The agreements reduced large-scale maritime conflict. Trade became safer, ports grew, commerce expanded, but stability always has a price. British influence increasingly shaped regional politics. External interests now affected local leadership decisions, and gradually, the Gulf became tied to global imperial systems far larger than itself. For local communities, the Gulf was changing psychologically as well as politically. The old tribal world still existed, but new realities were emerging. Foreign powers, global trade systems, international politics. The coastline was no longer isolated. It had become part of something larger. And once regions become strategically valuable, outside powers rarely lose interest. At this stage, the Gulf was valuable because of trade routes. But beneath the desert, another force waited silently: oil. At first, few understood how dramatically it would change the world. But within decades, that black liquid beneath the sand would transform poor coastal settlements into global centers of power. Before oil, before modern cities, the Gulf remained a region balancing tradition and change. Tribes still shaped society, pearls still powered economies, and Britain still dominated the sea. But history was accelerating, and the next transformation would change the Gulf forever. Because soon, the world would discover what lay beneath the desert, and everything would change. For centuries, the Gulf survived through trade, pearls, fishing, maritime routes, but beneath the sands, another resource waited silently, hidden, unnoticed: oil. At first, few understood its future importance. It was messy, difficult to extract, and in the early years of the 20th century, many still believed pearls would remain the Gulf's greatest source of wealth. But history was already changing, and beneath the desert, the modern world was preparing to emerge. Then came economic disaster. The global pearl market collapsed. Artificial cultured pearls from Asia flooded international markets. Demand for natural Gulf pearls declined rapidly. Entire coastal communities suffered. Families who had depended on pearl diving for generations lost their primary source of survival. And psychologically, this period created deep uncertainty. The old Gulf economy was dying, but the new one had not yet fully arrived. When oil was finally discovered in commercial quantities, everything accelerated. Foreign companies arrived, infrastructure expanded, new jobs emerged, roads appeared across the desert. What had once been isolated settlements began transforming into strategic economic centers. And for many local communities, the speed of change was overwhelming. History that once moved slowly for centuries was now moving within decades. Oil did more than create wealth. It reshaped identity. A new generation emerged in the Gulf, young leaders who understood that survival in the modern world required adaptation, education, infrastructure, diplomacy, and long-term vision. Because wealth alone does not build nations. Stability does, leadership does, planning does, and in the decades ahead, those qualities would become essential. By the mid-20th century, the British Empire itself was changing. Global pressures increased, empires across the world weakened, and eventually, Britain announced plans to withdraw from the Gulf. For local rulers, this created uncertainty, because the regional balance that had existed for decades was suddenly disappearing. And a dangerous question emerged: what happens after the empire leaves? Amid uncertainty, some leaders saw opportunity. Among them was Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan. He understood something many leaders throughout history failed to understand. Division weakens small states. Unity creates survival. The Gulf faced regional pressures, political instability, economic transformation, and foreign interests. A fragmented future would be dangerous, but a united future could create strength. Negotiations were difficult. Every ruler had different priorities, different concerns, different visions. But eventually, agreement emerged. And in 1971, the United Arab Emirates was officially founded. For the first time, multiple Emirates united under one nation. What had once been scattered coastal communities had become a state. The transformation that followed was extraordinary. Cities expanded rapidly, ports modernized, skyscrapers rose from the desert. Airports connected the Gulf to the world. And within decades, the UAE became one of the most globally connected nations on Earth. But beneath the glass towers and modern skylines, the memory of the old Gulf still remained. The sea, the tribes, the trade routes, the struggle for survival. Perhaps the greatest transformation was psychological. For centuries, the Gulf had been viewed by outsiders as peripheral, remote, harsh. But modern Gulf states changed that perception completely. The UAE became a symbol of rapid modernization, ambition, global influence, and strategic vision. Yet history rarely disappears, because modern nations are built on layers of older stories of migration, conflict, trade, empire, and survival. From the rise of the Qarmatians, to the chaos that shook Mecca, from tribal coastlines to imperial influence, from pearl divers to global cities, the history of the Gulf was never simple. It was shaped by survival, adaptation, and constant reinvention. And perhaps that is the real story of the UAE, not just wealth, but transformation. History is never only about the past. It is about how societies survive change, how regions reinvent themselves, and how people transform uncertainty into identity. If you enjoyed this documentary, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more deep historical stories that shape the modern world.